אני מתכבד להזמין את הגנרל, 4 כוכבים, מצבא אוסטרליה, מרק אוונס, please.
Well, I think I got the most difficult presentation. It's getting late in the afternoon and keeping people awake, so we'll see how I go. You can score me at the end. Well, General, ladies and gentlemen, it's a great privilege to be asked to address this conference. The nexus between the military forces and civilian populations is a critical subject when considering the conduct of military operations. It needs profound consideration by my profession. I was very impressed by the commanders this morning in their considered presentations of this subject. I'm not an expert in the law of armed conflict, nor am I an academic, but I have been an operational and tactical commander responsible for the conduct of military operations, invariably in complex situations and invariably with my focus being drawn to the relationship between the military and the civil population. I've no complete answers for military commanders on how to conduct military operations in cities and towns specifically. Such operations are a manifestation of the new complexities of modern warfare. They are diverse, will always be problematic, always full of errors, imperfections, and contradictions. Success can best be achieved by comprehending the nature of war, the characteristics of modern military operations, fully understanding and managing the complex environment in which they are conducted, and achieving the right balance in dealing with the adversary, the civil population, and the many other protagonists that are in the battle space. My intention today is not to get into tactical detail and fight this conundrum from street to street, but rather provide an Australian perspective. First, on our doctrinal response to this issue, and then my own personal perspective as a military commander. Well, what's different today? Sorry, another point. None of my statements are absolute statements. What is different today from military operations conducted in the past? There is a perennial debate regarding war's nature and characteristics. Clausewitz, I think, had it right. The nation-state paradigm on which Clausewitz based his theory is unlikely to change in the near future. While we've seen the proliferation of non-state actors, nationhood remains an attractive option for many. The nature of war remains unchanged. Clausewitz identified the relationship that exists between governments, civil populations and military forces. He recognised that despite the emergence of new technologies, war was fundamentally about the human condition. Though a political act, it was the clash of human wills. It was Hobbesian in its nature, brutish, violent. It embraced soldier, senator and citizen alike. The fortunes of nation-states, military forces and civil populations were entangled, and the possibility of conflict occurring between military forces alone with no need to consider civilian populations was unlikely. What has changed, though, is that modern military operations have gained a broader application than war itself. Given the increasing web and complexities of security challenges facing nation-states, we need to see military forces as having a role in a broader campaign that includes the period of normalcy, what we as operational planners in Australia called Phase 0, and along with other arms of government to shape the environment, engage with the population and hedge and shape against warlike operations. It's the changing character of modern military operations that we need to attend to. Its backdrop is a world of continual change. Population growth, corresponding diminution of resources such as fresh water, an enlarged wealth poverty gap, climate change, exponential changes in technology, increasing world urbanisation, changes in the international political and social frameworks, all impact on the characteristics of modern military operations. While military operations have always been complex, for the military commander, changes in the environment create emerging complexities for the military force. From trends emerging in the 1990s, General Krulak of the Marine Corps used the term three-block war to describe a new reality whereby military forces could be required to conduct conventional warfighting, peacekeeping operations and humanitarian assistance simultaneously within the space of 3 blocks in a city. Some military theorists describe us as moving into the 4th generation of warfare, characterised by loose, ill-defined networks of adversaries, even more powerful through information technology, focused on the erosion of political will rather than damage to the military force per se. Perhaps such operations will demand from the military force patience and restraint rather than a ruthless pursuit of the adversary's destruction. Control of cities and ports and the subjugation of civilian populations have been military objectives since war began. Even Alexander, I think, was at Tyre, not far away. Nations will continue to urbanise, and the adversary will migrate to the cities from the jungles, the mountains and the deserts, avoiding where he can be more easily located, watched and targeted. Such operations will be characterised by the ubiquitous scrutiny of the journalist and the international lawyer. Every week, 1 million people migrate from rural areas to the urban sprawl. Half the human race lives in cities. These cities are fragile. They house a clash of civilizations, from the mega wealthy to the ultra poor, the dispossessed, the fringe dweller and the criminal. These cities have all the characteristics of the agrarian, industrial and high technology ages all rolled into one. They are the centre point for political power, information hubs, the marketplace for transnational crime and the breeding ground for terrorism. They are a labyrinth of buildings, streets, tunnels and sewers covered by a sea of humanity that can favour the defender, the local and the mischievous. With increasing urbanisation, the military force can endeavour to do one of 2 things, or maybe 3, but I'll talk about 2. It can lever off its technologies for intelligence and standoff capabilities, or it can immerse itself in the environment and apply a human-centric approach. Embracing the cities as our operating areas provides for our own asymmetry and can be the opportunity rather than a threat, placing emphasis on smart soldiers supported by smart weapons. The adversary will endeavour to neutralise our strength and amplify our weaknesses. They'll be asymmetric in conducting their operations from within a compliant population. They will be less disciplined, have less regard for conventions, rules of law, and they perceive that they are less likely to be called to account for their actions and their contraventions. In determining success, they'll have to achieve less to succeed. Militarily, they will endeavour to diminish the effectiveness of our standoff capabilities, draw us into a game of attrition, and attempt to let time degrade our moral legitimacy. The civilian population may well be ethnically, culturally and religiously different from the military force. And here we should avoid the arrogance that says we understand the population. I operated in Northern Ireland a long time ago as part of the British force in an environment where the civilian population used the same language as us. We both watched the same television channels, worshipped the same God, and ethnically we were more or less the same. yet I cannot say I really understood the Irish, and perhaps don't to this day. None of us did. We hadn't shared their history, nor did we understand their tribal tribulations and their social nuances. We lacked the finesse and the understanding of the situation to be truly successful tactically. As soldiers, we would operate in an area for months. The people and the adversary had lived there most of their lives. At the end of a tour, we would go home, they would remain and see new young soldiers come in, start a new cycle of searches, lift operations and patrols. And so, if it is difficult when the difference between the soldier and the civilian is small, how much more difficult is it for the military force when the void is wider? Afghanistan was a case in point for us. The complexity of human networks could only be really understood through long-term knowledge of that complex environment. The propensity for manipulation by others and miscalculation by us was high. We need to invest in understanding the cities and their populations. Leverage of indigenous and human intelligence capabilities becomes vital. Whether or not the civilian population is pro or anti the military, they have one thing that provides leverage for that force, and that is the desire to return to normalcy. Most people want security for their family, a home, food and access to clean water, good health and education for their children, and freedom to worship their God. The civilian population is unlikely to be completely acquiescent to the force, but they can be influenced and they can be supportive to the force if they provide the key to normalcy. It's in the end the civilian population that provides the oxygen for either side. Central to modern military operations is the need to achieve a positive perception, compliant behaviour and, if possible, support and at best allegiance from some of the population groups. This can only be achieved by engagement, and the population becomes the centre of gravity. Enmeshed with the civilian population is the information environment where bits and bytes flow endlessly through the urban sprawl into computers, televisions, radios and iPhones. Facebook, Twitter and blogs abound even in the poorest neighbourhoods of the poorest city. And this is a domain that needs to be captured in order to communicate, inform, educate, persuade and provide hope. Now, the Australian doctrinal response has been influenced by our experience since the early 1990s. We've deployed in that time to Somalia, Cambodia, Bougainville, East Timor, the Solomon Islands, Iraq and Afghanistan. And our operations have drawn us to operate in population centres. Our military operations have occurred in difficult environments, exposing us to new complexities, which we judge requires a different response, a response that can deal with a broad range of options. The common thread on all these instances has been the necessary interaction by the military force with the civilian population. And while we possess superior firepower, mobility and surveillance capabilities, the adversary has surprise, agility, population support and time on their side. In fighting an adversary that operates amongst the people, we've had to change our mindset as to what constitutes success. The central objective may no longer be to destroy the enemy, but to secure the population. Our operational experience has caused us to comprehensively review our doctrine, and our response is what we call adaptive campaigning. I'm not a buzzword person, but that's what we call it. Our focus is through the lens of the complex domains rather than the densely populated area per se. It's based on the premise that the military must be one part of a coherent whole of government approach that has a campaign style. So, in effect, I call this military operations in densely populated areas rather than fighting in densely populated areas, because we see it as a campaign that is cyclic goes round and round, and all the time you're trying to achieve that normalcy or phase zero that I talked about. Whatever you want to call it, this new complexity has turned Australian doctrine to lever off the quality of the Australian soldier and human-centric lines of operation. It recognises the need for a close presence, operations being conducted inside the complex terrain with a focus on scalable, close combat capabilities. The distinction between low, medium and high intensity operations is no longer seen as relevant. There is no transition from one to another. It's part of that whole campaign cycle. Focus is on the close combat capability, as the intent is not to stand off but to engage the adversary in close combat and develop a relationship with the civilian population, enabling influence and allowing domination of the environment. In consequence, the military force requires an array of lethal and non-lethal capabilities. It needs to be supported by equipments and technologies that will enhance the force and population protection and be structured to engage with the civilian population as effectively as with the adversary. With this campaign approach, we recognise that the military will operate in a joint interagency command or environment, drawing off all the agencies of government, foreign affairs and what have you. So it's not a singular military operation that we see. Our success will be dedicated on adaptive action. At the operational and tactical levels, we need to understand the environment and all the aspects of that complex terrain, identify changes to systems and normalcy as and when they occur and quicker than the adversary can, and correct them or adapt to the changes quicker than the adversary can. And we see the operational environment as one of competitive learning with a continuous adaptive cycle of act, sense, decide and adapt. Similarly, we see the importance of mission command, and I know the Israelis were great supporters of the mission command concept. Quick and robust decision making needs to occur at the appropriate level. This is difficult when our technologies actually enable centralised control of decision making, what our soldiers call the 12,000-mile screwdriver. Our decision-making structures need to be less hierarchical than the adversary, and our decision-making loops need to be tighter. And we need to empower this strategic corporal that we possess. Now, I haven't got a lot of time, so I'll just give you my own personal perspective after 40 years of doing this stuff. Doctrine, which I've just covered, plays an important function for military forces inasmuch that it sets the basic tenets for its operations. But in the end, it's your human resource, your men and women, from general to private, who determine the way and the standard by which operations will be conducted. Operational success or failure will be dependent on the quality of the force, underpinned by national character, ethos and values, education and training, and a discipline code. Speaking from an Australian perspective, we're largely cosmopolitan, democratic and liberal, well-educated, I like to think, got a sense of fair play, particularly in rugby, and we're technologically adept. We've got a very small population base, and we need to avoid campaigns of attrition. We have the attributes to operate well in the complex terrain of the 21st century. The importance of the human factor for us cannot be underplayed. It's our strength. Above all things, this is the key to success or failure for us. Now, if I'm asked about the selection of military operational commanders, I say that they need to be comfortable with ambiguity, pragmatic, educated and smart, tough, resilient, adaptable, cognizant and versed in the rules and laws of war, possessing moral courage, good at communicating, and able to get on well with others. They need a broader perspective and should feel at home in a coalition and an interagency environment. They need to be mentally agile and dexterous, and they need humility, a lack of hubris, and they also need a very good sense of humour, because they need one. This is the type of commander who will be able to turn these new complexities to his or her advantage. As an operational commander, I was continually challenged with alignment. The operational and tactical intents often seem to diverge. Some tactical commanders are very comfortable with traditional roles and tasks, to kill the enemy efficiently. They're good at it, and they do it well. But they do find it difficult to understand and translate strategic objectives to tactical action, and or apply their capabilities to new complexities or requirements such as indigenous capabilities. So without correction, the danger was sometimes we were doing things on the ground that were misaligned with the strategic intent. In Afghanistan, our battle group, and it was a fine battle group, was trained and structured for warfighting, and the commanders sometimes couldn't make that mental leap that their core task was not to kill insurgents. The selection of the operational commander is the key. You need commanders smart enough to adapt. Their role was indigenous capability building. The law of armed conflict may not require a great deal of further specificity for me. I get it. And I think most commanders do. Simplicity is preferred over complexity. So with all the talk that I heard today, I think about that poor corporal down there. Does he get this? And it's got to be really simple for him or her. However, the combatant civilian paradigm needs consistent review given some of the trends and complexities. Who are the combatants? And we've had that discussion today. Distinction and proportionality needs as much lucidity as we can articulate. I think that all of us in the Broad understand the law of armed conflict. It's in its application where it goes wrong. It can never be effective if the combatants are not signed up to it in their own minds. And the military force operations are not underpinned by a military ethos and values and a robust, effective and open military discipline and justice system that is intrinsic. One of the major issues internationally must be the vigorous pursuit and prosecution of those responsible for war crimes, including non-state actors. But it's the rules of engagement that need the full attention of military commanders. It's not the sole domain of the lawyer or the staff officer. Prior to endorsement, commanders like me need to sit down and read the rules line by line and operationalise them and visualise them in their mind. What does each one really mean to the soldier, the civilian and the adversary? I saw that getting our ROE right is one of my key responsibilities. The challenge is that of achieving a balance between protecting the force, safeguarding the population and reducing the advantage to the adversary. We also need to be flexible in our approach. I was inculcated as a young officer in the doctrine of shoot to kill. That in the land battle, there was no such thing as a warning shot. So when you fired your weapon, you shot to kill. Other countries use different methods. But it doesn't take into account the civilians that move around the operational area. Yet in Iraq and Afghanistan, too many non-combatants were shot because they failed to heed or see or understand the warnings. And in some instances, perhaps a warning shot may have provided that moment for comprehension. It took us too long to adapt to protect the population, and all the while our legitimacy eroded. We're often too slow to introduce new operating procedures and new capabilities, and we're not always good at retaining lessons learned. In the Iraqi theatre, we learned a lot of hard lessons regarding escalation of force that were not transferred across to the Afghan theatre as quickly as I would have liked. This comes back to organisational dexterity and flexibility and adaptability, and additionally that need for scalable capabilities short of lethal, I think, is fundamental to that new environment. What I know is that international law and all that must be fundamental and underpin the way our operations are conducted. My experience in Northern Ireland, in Timor and the Middle East reinforces for me that if we blur the lines, if we caveat because of a particular circumstance to suit our own needs, then we start to look very much like the enemy we fight, and we debase the very principles that we fight for. Time. Adopting an Eastern approach to time. What struck me in recent conflicts is the imperative of time as it's seen by the Western military force vis-à-vis the Eastern adversary. We have an instinctive need for action. We've got great junior commanders who want to get stuck in. We are strategically, operationally and tactically harnessed to the need for quick victories in days, weeks and months, whereas our adversary thinks in terms of seasons, years and generations. And we have a need to change the status quo, and quickly, driven by, amongst other things, political cycles, budgets, media and public opinion. In many ways, our adversary can be content with the status quo, at least in the short to mid-term. He can use our impetuosity to his ends. To us, it will be important that we secure a particular objective or kill a particular target tonight, this day. To the adversary, it doesn't matter untowardly if the IED that he has laid on the route to the patrol base hits its target today, tomorrow, next week, next month. The Special Forces were involved in a night raid in southern Afghanistan to kill or capture an insurgent believed to be at a certain house. The operation was well planned. Intelligence appeared robust. Rehearsals were completed. The raid went like clockwork. Unfortunately, the insurgent had decamped. The operation was completed early and the helicopters were not due for some time. The commander was disappointed. He and his men had been keen to get a positive outcome. He decided they'd try another house not far away. Time was beginning to compress, intelligence was less robust, and clearances had not been obtained. Things were beginning to get rushed. The raid went ahead, and inadvertently a number of civilians were killed. No insurgents were captured. A small, normal activity had turned into a disaster. I'm left wondering if we'd not allowed ourselves to be hostage to time and the need to achieve a quick result. Had we been more circumspect, sure, we wouldn't have captured that insurgent, but I know we would have got him at some time. We certainly wouldn't have ended up with civilian casualties and an adverse public reaction against our broader mission. Our Western approach can have catastrophic results with strategic and political consequences. Unnecessary high military and civilian casualty rates and incorrect targets being neutralised all have a deleterious effect on our campaign. Such things also start to consume you. We should choose the time of events and not get drawn into actions that are in fact reactions. Linked to a re-evaluation of our concept of time must be a fresh look at priorities and what constitutes success in the campaign paradigm. And then there is the discipline of the force. In Timor, my brigade's tactical accomplishments were highly lauded by the Australian community, fledgling Timorese government and the United Nations. And yet all that great work by about 4,000 highly professional troops was almost undone by the ill discipline of a few in their relationship with the civilian community. Even though the incidents were minor, drinking and trespass, no civilians were harmed, the media were all too willing to create a storm, and our good reputation was in danger of being sullied. Generally, an Indigenous population will be accepting of a tough, no-nonsense force, highly professional, that is empathetic, but will quickly become hostile to perceived ill discipline. The importance of a disciplined force is critical to mission success, and force discipline rests on the strength, the morality, quality and common sense of the junior leader. It is the young officer, the corporal and the sergeant who will make things happen at the tactical level. It is they who can wrench victory out of the jaws of defeat. They are the guardians of the character and the values of the tactical force. They will set the standards and they will determine your tactical success. They need the qualities of physical and moral courage, and they need to be empathetic with the civilian population. Lever off the support provided by other agencies and be able to see the concept of minimum force being more than the application of maximum force for the minimum period of time. And they need to be able to identify the nexus between tactical actions and strategic outcomes. They need to try to emulate the style of the mailed fist in the velvet glove. And they need to be able to apply their training in a principle-based way rather than through rote and dogma. When I observe tactical failure, it's often as a result of the lack of junior leadership. I'm left asking, where was that corporal? Where was the officer? Who said stop? So investment in our junior leadership is pretty fundamental in this new complex environment. We need to train them and select them at exacting standards. In this new operating space, I am an infantryman, but I will say it. The king of the battlefield is the infantryman. More so now than ever before. He and the battle group he forms the basis of will have more than any other task force the task of close combat and therefore the closest contact with the civilian population. It is he or she that will be the point for the relationship that exists between the military force and that population. It will be what he or she does and says to the baker or the artisan and his family at the checkpoint that will determine the level of the relationship. It is these soldiers who need to intuitively understand that the military benefit of incessant cordon and searches, prolonged vehicle checkpoints and seemingly arbitrary lift operations of large numbers of fighting-age males may be outweighed by the adverse reaction of the civilian population that's trying to claw itself back to normalcy. There is a misguided image held by some that the task of the infantryman does not require the smart soldier. The converse is emphatically true. Not all, but a good proportion of soldiers in the combat arms should be above average in intellect and EQ, demonstrate linguistic capability and be able to see the bigger picture. The task of the infantryman has become more intricate if we want him to engage inside the population areas. Just a quick word about the Special Forces. Tier 1 Special Forces will play an important role against the adversary by the nature of the way they operate with precision. From secure bases, their focus on kill and capture has drawn them away from the civil population, and they lack that real understanding that needs to be gained by a battle group that is resident inside the urban area. Commanders need to ensure that a correct balance is placed on special forces vis-à-vis residential operations. So in conclusion, how much time have I got left? Conclusion. As the world becomes increasingly urbanised, battles such as El Alamein in the Libyan desert will become less likely. A less clear challenge is emerging where operations have numerous facets and multiple lines of operation. Such operations bring new complexities and new challenges for the force. They have revealed the limitations of the application of force, and it will require us to look at differently at what mission success at the tactical and operations really is. We need to take a longer-term, comprehensive campaign approach to military operations, striving to remain in phase zero for much of the time and building up our capital with the civilian population. Operations in densely populated areas need a whole-of-government approach, and we need to think about the utilisation of joint interagency models and leveraging of all the capabilities of soft and hard power in a coherent way. The military force, as I've said, needs to be well trained, collectively and individually. It needs to remember the importance of human interaction in this complex environment and the need for constant patrolling and understanding comprehensively the human domain. Most importantly, we need to invest in our soldiers. The combat forces in particular needs to come up close and personal with the civilian population and engage with it, and force protection becomes linked to population protection. We cannot look at one without dealing with the other. The rack cunning and hardiness of the street fighter becomes more important as a quality for tactical success, as it will become dependent on closeness with the adversary and by extension the civil community. And finally, I believe that in the end, those who can win the hearts and minds of people, both at home and also in the operational area where we may be asked to fight, will win the war eventually. This can only happen if military operations are fought in a highly ethical way, that we comply with the laws of armed conflict, that our forces are highly professional and disciplined, and we understand the complex environment in which we ask our soldiers to operate and fight. Thank you very much.